Does the Quran have a perfect oral tradition that preserves the Quran and can be traced back to Muhammad? Well, this is the question answered by Quran manuscript expert Dr. Keith E. Small. He writes, "An oral tradition is not in question. What is contested, however, is how complete and strong this tradition was to preserve the specific pronunciation of the text as it was received. If a written version was produced within decades of Muhammad's death, this would demonstrate that a strict oral transmission was not considered enough of a safeguard to preserve the text. The manuscript evidence best supports a view that an oral tradition of the specific pronunciation of the text was never strong enough to unify the earliest Muslim community on one standard recitation of the text. The mechanics and systems were not in place to establish and maintain an indisputable precise oral pronunciation of the ambiguous text of the Quran. The textual mechanics were not in place in that there were multiple authoritative texts after Muhammad's death, which would have each required a separate oral tradition. Otherwise, a written redaction, like the one attributed to Uthman, would not have been needed. Uthman's collection, being an exercise to limit written variety of the text, was also as much a deliberate effort to limit oral recitation to a single written version of the text. Though this early standardization of the text did provide a basis of unity, it was not precise enough to present the development of rival recitation systems, nor did it completely displace the use of different recitatal systems based on other forms of the text attributed to other companions of Muhammad. The best explanation for the textual variance is that competing recitals and written versions of the Quran did in fact exist. The oral tradition was not strong enough to keep them completely in check. Then, after the text was in place, there was a degree of flexibility allowed concerning its precise pronunciation that grew into a multiplicity of recital systems that were being practiced some 250 years later, when Ibn Mujahid found it necessary to try and limit them to 7. Some of these other systems were possibly tied to text that preceded the standardized one, but most of them seem to have been based on different ways of applying diacritical and vocalization marks to the standard text. Manuscripts from this would have allowed this degree of flexibility, and the system of colored dots for vocalization confirmed that the more systems than the 7 or 10 were being practiced. Now, as the oral tradition became more standardized, it advanced the need for a more precise Arabic script, and at the same time, the more precise the Arabic script enabled the oral tradition to be recorded and maintained with greater precision. This oral transmission is not a separate parallel transmission that has been kept separate and pristine from the written transmission throughout the Quran's history. Rather, the various oral recitation systems have always arisen from the written text and the ambiguities allowed by its basic form. Now, arguments that say that this is a fabrication cannot be maintained because there are manuscripts that preserve distinctive readings of the Quran. Also, there is a lack of evidence that the survival of one form of recitation can be traced directly back to Muhammad. Now, political and religious motives may have been sufficient reasons for the people to abuse a recitation that did not serve their sectarian purposes, but a more sufficient reason would be the defective character of the Arabic script. The colored dot systems do not present the short vowels with the precision required to record and transmit a complete reading system, and the chains of names of transmitters of these systems are also not enough. See, the growth represented by the development of the 8 eventual versions of the 10 recitation systems occurred when the script was already developed enough to contain and preserve a precise recitation of the text. If there was this amount of flexibility and growth with such a system in place, there could have been no guarantee strong enough to prevent similar growth of reading systems before such a system was invented. Now, though an extensive oral tradition has been claimed for the Quran, it was never strong enough to guard one precise form of pronunciation, and the oral traditions that have existed have always been tied to particular versions of the written text, especially after improvements were added to the text to make it more precise. Thanks for watching. Please post your questions and comments below.